The candles had barely been lit when Winifred heard her husband's voice through the study door, low and certain, telling his solicitor that the marriage was nothing more than a transaction. She had been standing in the corridor with her hand raised to knock, still wearing her wedding dress, still smelling of orange blossom and church incense, when the words reached her and stopped her cold. A transaction, nothing more. She lowered her hand slowly and stepped back from the door as if it had burned her. Marcus Ellery, Duke of Cambourne, did not know his wife was listening. He sat behind his father's old desk, signing papers that made her his, in the eyes of the law, and spoke of her the way a man might speak of a horse he had purchased at auction. Necessary, suitable, nothing more. Winifred returned to her chamber and sat by the cold hearth until midnight, waiting for a husband who never came. 3 days earlier she had stood in the drawing room of her family's crumbling townhouse and listened to her brother explain, in a voice that shook with shame, that their family owed more money than they could ever repay. Captain Frederick Colton had gambled away what little remained of their father's fortune, and the men he owed were not patient. There was only one way to save the family name, one way to keep her brother from debtor's prison, and it wore a title and a cold expression. Winifred had agreed to marry the Duke of Cambourne within the hour. She had never met him before the betrothal was announced. She had imagined, in her foolish private hopes, that a man who would rescue a stranger's family from ruin might have some warmth buried beneath his reputation for coldness. She had been wrong. The wedding itself had been small and quiet, held in the chapel at Cambourne House with only a handful of witnesses. Marcus had stood beside her through the ceremony, with the composure of a man attending a business meeting. He had placed the ring on her finger without meeting her eyes. He had kissed her cheek, not her lips, in front of the small gathering, and something in that single choice had told Winifred everything she needed to know about the years ahead of her. Now, on the first night of her marriage, she sat alone in a house that did not feel like her own, in a dress she would never wear again, and understood with painful clarity that she had traded one kind of poverty for another. She had escaped debt and shame, but she had walked into a marriage with a man who saw her as paperwork. She did not cry. She had promised herself, on the carriage ride to Cambourne House, that she would not give this man the satisfaction of her tears, not even when no one was watching. She unpinned her hair herself, since her new lady's maid had already been dismissed for the night, and looked at her own reflection in the mirror for a long time. The Duchess of Cambourne. The title sounded absurd on her own tongue. In the morning she came down to breakfast to find her husband already at the table, reading correspondence with the same detached focus he had shown at their wedding. He rose when she entered, as propriety demanded, and gestured for her to sit. "I trust you slept well," he said, in the tone of a man asking about the weather. "Well enough," Winifred replied, and reached for the teapot before a servant could reach it for her. She would not be waited on like a doll in this house. She would at least pour her own tea. Marcus watched her for a moment, something unreadable crossing his face, and then returned to his letters. He did not ask her anything further. He did not offer conversation. When he finished eating, he excused himself to attend to estate matters, leaving Winifred alone at a table set for a family of 6, in a house that echoed with silence. She spent the following days learning the shape of her new life. Cambourne House was vast, grand, and cold in every sense of the word. The staff treated her with careful respect, unsure yet whether their new mistress would prove kind or difficult. Winifred made a point of learning every servant's name within the first week, of thanking the maids who lit her fires and the footmen who carried her letters, because she remembered too well what it felt like to be invisible in her own home. Marcus, meanwhile, remained a stranger who happened to share her table twice a day. He was not cruel to her. He was simply absent, even when he sat across from her. He spoke of tenant matters and parliamentary business and the weather, and never once asked what she thought, what she wanted, or how she felt about the sudden, enormous change to her entire life. On the 5th night, Winifred worked up the courage to knock on the door of his study after dinner. She had rehearsed what she would say, some careful attempt to build a bridge between them, some small step toward the kind of partnership a marriage was supposed to be. "Come in," Marcus called, and when she entered, she saw surprise flicker across his face before he schooled it back into composure. "Your Grace, is something wrong?" The formality of the address, from her own husband, struck her like a slap. "I wondered if we might speak," Winifred said carefully. "About the household, about how you would like things run. I would like to understand my place here." Marcus set down his pen. For a moment she thought she saw something soften in his eyes, some flicker of the man beneath the title. Then it vanished, replaced by the same careful distance he wore like armor. "Your place is Duchess of Cambourne," he said. "You need not concern yourself further than that. Mrs. Griggs manages the household affairs. She will answer any questions you have. I did not ask for a housekeeper's opinion, Winifred said, before she could stop herself. I asked for yours. Something flashed across his face, quick and sharp, gone before she could name it. I have given you my answer, he said, and picked his pen back up, a clear dismissal. Winifred stood there a moment longer, feeling something inside her chest crack quietly, and then she turned and left without another word. She did not knock on that door again for a long time. She wrote to her brother that week, careful to keep her letters light and full of small observations about the house and the gardens, saying nothing of the loneliness that had settled into her bones like winter cold. Frederick had enough guilt weighing on him already. She would not add to it by telling him the truth, that she had married a man who looked at her the way one looks at a ledger that has, at last, been balanced. She began to explore the grounds instead, since the house itself offered so little comfort. The gardens at Cambourne were beautiful, wild in places where the old gardener had let nature have its way, and Winifred found herself walking them each morning before the house woke, before she had to face another day of polite distance from her husband. It was on one such morning, 3 weeks into her marriage, that she found the old chapel at the far edge of the estate, half hidden by ivy and untended for years. She stepped inside out of curiosity and found dust and cobwebs, but also a strange, peaceful quiet that the grand house never offered her. She began returning there most mornings, sitting in the empty pews, letting herself simply exist without an audience to perform composure for. She did not know, on that first morning in the old chapel, that her husband had once come there too, as a boy, hiding from a father whose coldness had shaped the very distance Marcus now offered her without meaning to. She did not know that the transaction he had spoken of on their wedding night had been a lie he told himself, a wall he built the moment he realized, standing beside her at the altar, that he felt something he had sworn never to feel again. All Winifred knew, in those first quiet weeks, was that she had married a man who kept himself locked away behind polite words and careful distance, and that she had no idea yet whether anything real lived behind that wall, or whether she had bound herself for life to an empty house and an empty marriage. She resolved, sitting alone in the dusty chapel with dust motes floating in the morning light, that she would not spend the rest of her life waiting for a door that might never open. If Marcus Ellery wanted a wife in name only, she would give him nothing less than what he offered her in return. She would build a life within the walls he had given her, and she would guard the last soft parts of her heart carefully, because she had already learned, in 3 short weeks, exactly how much this marriage could cost her if she let it. She did not yet know how wrong she was about what lay behind her husband's silence, or how long it would take either of them to find the courage to break it. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm that felt, to Winifred, less like a marriage and more like a careful truce between 2 strangers sharing a roof. Breakfast at 8, brief and formal. Dinner at 7, filled with polite nothing. Nights spent in separate wings of a house so large that days could pass without their paths crossing at all outside those 2 meals. Winifred told herself she was adjusting. She told herself that many marriages among the nobility were built this way, on convenience rather than affection, and that she should be grateful for a husband who was not unkind, only distant. She told herself many things in those early weeks, and most of them were lies she needed to survive the loneliness settling into the corners of her new life. She had not expected, when she agreed to marry a duke to save her brother, that the hardest part would not be the loss of her old life, but the slow, grinding ache of being unseen inside her new one. She began in those early weeks to study her husband the way one studies a locked door, searching for some seam, some hinge, some small weakness that might explain how a man could be so composed at every hour of every day. She noticed that he took his coffee black and strong, that he read the same 3 newspapers each morning in the same order, that he always paused for exactly a moment before answering any question that touched on his own feelings, as though weighing carefully how little he could say and still remain polite. She noticed, too, the portrait that hung above the fireplace in the great hall, a stern-faced man with Marcus's same dark eyes and none of his occasional softness, and she asked one of the older maids, quietly, who the man had been. "The late Duke, Your Grace," the maid said, dropping her voice as though the portrait itself might overhear. "His Grace's father. A hard man by all accounts, not unkind to the servant's mind, but cold, terribly cold. Folks used to say the young master learned early never to show what he was feeling, on account of what happened when he did." The maid would say no more, hurrying off to her duties before Winifred could press further, but the words lodged themselves in her mind and would not leave. She began to look at her husband differently after that. wondering what a boy raised beneath that stern portrait might have learned about love, and what it might cost a man to unlearn it. She wrote nothing of this to Frederick, not wanting to burden him further, but she confided it instead to her private journal, a small leather book she had begun keeping in the evenings when the house grew too quiet to bear in silence. "I begin to wonder," she wrote one night, "whether I have married a man incapable of warmth, or simply a man who has never once been shown how to offer it. I cannot yet tell which, and I fear the answer may determine the whole of the rest of my life." She closed the journal that night with a strange, stubborn resolve settling in her chest, a determination that whatever the answer proved to be, she would not simply fade quietly into the role of an ornamental wife, forgotten in the corners of a grand house. She would make herself known here, whether her husband chose to see her or not. Lady Serafina Kello arrived at Cambourne House on a bright afternoon in early autumn, announced by a footman who seemed nervous simply saying her name. Winifred was in the small drawing room, working on needlework she had no real interest in, when the woman swept in wearing a shade of green that made her look like she belonged in a painting rather than a farmhouse parlor. "Your Grace," Serafina said, offering a curtsy so shallow it barely counted as one. "I do hope I am not intruding. Marcus and I are such old friends. I felt I simply must call and welcome his new bride properly." Winifred set down her needlework and offered a polite smile that did not reach her eyes. "How kind of you to think of me." "Oh, I think of you often," Serafina said, settling onto the settee across from her with the easy confidence of someone who had sat in that exact spot many times before. "Marcus and I grew up together, you know. Our families have been close for generations. I confess I was quite surprised when I heard he had married so suddenly, and to someone none of us had ever met." The implication sat heavy in the air between them, unspoken but perfectly clear. Winifred had married a stranger, an outsider, someone who did not belong in the world Serafina Kello so effortlessly occupied. "Circumstances brought us together quickly," Winifred said carefully, "but I find I am settling in well." "Of course you are," Serafina said, in a tone that suggested she believed the opposite entirely. "Cambourne House can feel rather large and cold at first, can it not? I remember visiting as a girl and finding it quite overwhelming. Marcus was always such a serious child. His father was terribly hard on him, you know. I think it left him rather unable to show what he feels, even when he feels it deeply." Winifred wanted to ask what Marcus felt deeply, and for whom, but she held her tongue. She would not give this woman the satisfaction of seeing how little she knew about her own husband. Serafina stayed for nearly an hour, filling the silence with stories of Marcus as a young man, tales that painted herself at the center of his history, in ways that made Winifred's stomach tighten with something she refused to name as jealousy. When she finally left, promising to call again soon, Winifred sat alone in the drawing room feeling smaller than she had in weeks. That evening at dinner, she mentioned the visit to Marcus, watching carefully for his reaction. "Lady Kello called on me today," she said. "She spoke a great deal about your history together." Something flickered across his face, quick and guarded. "Serafina has always enjoyed the sound of her own voice," he said, and returned to his meal, offering nothing further. Winifred could not tell if the tightness in his jaw meant he was troubled by the visit or merely irritated at the interruption to his evening, and his silence gave her no way to know which. She wrote to Josephine Rowe that week, her closest friend since childhood, the one person who had known her before the marriage, before the title, before the careful mask she now wore each day. Josephine's reply arrived within days, full of warmth and worry in equal measure. "You must come stay with me for a visit," Josephine wrote. "Even a duchess is allowed friends. Winifred, do not let that grand house swallow you whole." Winifred read the letter 3 times before folding it carefully and tucking it into her writing desk, a small piece of comfort in a house that offered so little of it. Frederick's letters came less often, and when they did, they carried a strain Winifred recognized immediately, even through his careful attempts to hide it. His ship had been assigned to patrol dangerous waters, and though he wrote cheerfully of his crew and his duties, Winifred could read the fear beneath his words, the fear of a man trying to reassure a sister he had already asked too much of. She missed him fiercely in those quiet months. She missed the easy laughter of her old life, the warmth of a home where she had been known and loved rather than merely tolerated. She found herself spending more time in the old chapel at the edge of the grounds, more time walking the gardens alone, more time simply existing in spaces where no one expected anything from her at all. It was on one of these solitary walks that she first noticed Marcus watching her from his study window. She had not meant to look up, but something made her glance toward the house, and there he stood, half hidden by the curtain, watching her cross the lawn with an expression she could not read from that distance. By the time she lifted her hand in acknowledgement, he had already stepped back from the window, and when she returned to the house an hour later, he said nothing about it at dinner. She began to notice small things after that. The way he seemed to know her schedule without being told, arriving in rooms she had just left, or leaving rooms just before she entered them, as though he were avoiding her on purpose rather than simply following the natural rhythm of a large household. The way he sometimes started to speak at dinner, only to stop himself and return to silence, as though whatever he had almost said was too dangerous to release into the air between them. Winifred did not know what to make of these small, strange moments. She told herself she was imagining significance where none existed, searching for warmth in a man who had made his coldness clear from their very first night as husband and wife, but some quiet, stubborn part of her refused to fully believe it, refused to accept that the man who had shown fear for her safety in his eyes, however briefly, felt nothing at all. Serafina called again the following week, and the week after that, each visit filled with the same careful cruelty disguised as friendliness, the same casual references to a shared history Winifred could never compete with. Winifred began to dread the sound of the front door, the announcement of a visitor, the particular shade of green that Serafina seemed to favor above all others. She mentioned it to Josephine in her next letter, unable to keep the frustration from her pen. "This woman speaks to me as though I am a temporary guest in my own home," Winifred wrote, "as though the marriage is a mistake that will surely correct itself in time, and she will simply be waiting when it does." Josephine's reply was blunt, as always. "Then show her, and show your husband, that you have no intention of going anywhere. A woman who feels secure does not need to prove it to anyone, least of all a jealous rival wearing a friendly smile." Winifred took the advice to heart, though it cost her something to do it. She began attending to her duties as Duchess with renewed purpose, learning the accounts, visiting the tenant families, making herself indispensable to the running of Cambourne in ways that had nothing to do with her husband's affection, and everything to do with claiming a place for herself that no one, not even Serafina Kello, could take from her. Marcus noticed the change, though he said little about it directly. He began, in small ways, to include her in estate matters he had previously handled alone, mentioning a tenant dispute over dinner, asking her opinion on a repair to the mill, small cracks appearing in the wall he had built around himself. Winifred told herself not to read too much into these small offerings. She had been burned once already by hoping for more than this marriage seemed willing to give her. But late one night, unable to sleep, she passed his study on her way to the library and found the door slightly ajar. She should have walked on. Instead, she paused, and through the gap she saw Marcus sitting at his desk, not working, simply staring at a small portrait that sat among his papers. She could not see clearly from that angle, but something in the stillness of his posture, the weight in his shoulders, told her this was not a man reviewing estate accounts. This was a man alone with something he could not say aloud, even to himself. She did not go in. She was not ready, and neither, she suspected, was he. But she walked back to her chamber that night, carrying a small, fragile hope she had not expected to feel again, a hope she was almost afraid to acknowledge, even to herself, for fear of how much it might cost her if she was wrong. The following week brought a rare invitation, a small gathering at a neighboring estate hosted by a family Winifred had not yet met, and she found herself standing in front of her wardrobe, uncertain whether Marcus would wish her to attend at his side or excuse herself entirely, as he so often seemed to prefer. To her surprise, he appeared in her doorway that afternoon, already dressed for travel, offering his arm with a formality that could not quite hide the small, nervous energy beneath it. "I thought you might like company for the journey," he said simply, and Winifred took his arm without comment, unwilling to disturb whatever fragile impulse had brought him to her door. The gathering itself proved unremarkable, filled with the usual polite conversation and careful social maneuvering, but Winifred noticed, throughout the evening, that Marcus remained closer to her side than propriety strictly required, that he steered conversations gently toward topics she might enjoy, that he watched her across the room when he thought she would not notice, with an expression she was beginning to recognize as something more than mere obligation. When Lady Serafina appeared unexpectedly among the other guests, clearly having engineered her own invitation once she learned of theirs, Marcus's jaw tightened, and he found reasons to keep Winifred occupied in conversation elsewhere for the remainder of the evening, a small kindness she did not fail to notice. On the carriage ride home, exhausted and comfortable in the darkness, Winifred allowed herself to rest her head briefly against his shoulder, expecting him to shift away, as he so often did when moments grew too tender. Instead, he remained still, and after a long moment, she felt his hand settle gently over hers where it rested on the seat between them, saying nothing, offering nothing beyond that small, wordless comfort, but it was enough. in that quiet darkness, to make her believe again that something real might yet be possible between them. Smoke woke Winifred before the shouting did, a sharp, acrid smell curling under her door that sent her bolting upright in bed, before her mind had even fully caught up with her body. She threw on a robe and ran into the corridor, where a maid was already rushing past with a face white with fear. "The tenant cottages, Your Grace," the girl gasped, "down by the eastern fields. Fire's spreading fast, they say, and half the workers are still asleep in their beds." Winifred did not stop to think. She ran for the stairs, calling for someone to bring blankets and water, calling for the stable boy to ready horses, moving through the chaos of the waking household with a clarity that surprised even her. By the time she reached the courtyard, Marcus was already there, half-dressed, shouting orders to the grooms with an authority she had never seen him use before. He turned and saw her, and for one brief moment something raw and unguarded crossed his face, something that looked almost like fear, though whether it was fear for the tenants, or fear at seeing her standing there, ready to ride into danger herself, she could not say. "You should stay here," he said, already knowing she suspected that she would not listen. "I am coming," Winifred said, in a voice that left no room for argument, and something in his expression shifted, not quite a smile, but close enough to one that her heart lurched strangely in her chest. They rode together through the dark toward the orange glow lighting up the eastern sky, and by the time they reached the cottages, the scene was chaos. Flames had already claimed two of the smaller buildings, and tenant families stood in the yard clutching children and few possessions, faces streaked with soot and terror. Marcus dismounted before his horse had even fully stopped and began organizing the men into a bucket line from the well, his voice cutting through the panic with steady command. Winifred found herself pulled toward an elderly woman sitting alone on the ground, coughing badly, clearly overcome by smoke. She knelt beside her immediately, calling for water and a blanket, checking the woman's breathing with hands that did not shake despite the chaos around her. "My grandson," the old woman gasped between coughs. "He was still inside." "I could not reach him." Winifred's blood ran cold. She looked up and saw the smallest cottage, the one nearest the barn, still fully engulfed, and without allowing herself time to think about the danger, she was on her feet and running toward it. Winifred. She had never heard Marcus use her given name before, not once in their entire marriage, and the raw panic in his voice as he shouted it stopped her for only a heartbeat before she pushed forward anyway. A young farmhand grabbed her arm before she reached the door, shaking his head fiercely. "Already got him out, Your Grace," he shouted over the roar of the flames. "Pulled the boy free not 2 minutes past. He's with the others, safe and coughing but safe." Relief flooded through her so suddenly her knees nearly buckled, and it was Marcus's arm that caught her, appearing at her side as though he had crossed the yard in a single stride. He pulled her back from the heat of the burning cottage, his grip on her tight enough to bruise, his breathing ragged in a way that had nothing to do with the smoke. "Do not do that again," he said, low and fierce, his face close to hers, lit orange by the flames. "Do you understand me? Never again." "There was a child," Winifred said, still shaking, though whether from the fear of the fire or the intensity in her husband's eyes, she could not say. "I know," Marcus said, and something in his voice cracked, just slightly, just enough for her to hear the fear underneath the command. "I know there was, but it could have been you in there, and I could not." He stopped himself, jaw tightening, the wall going back up before he could finish the sentence. They worked through the rest of the night side by side, fighting the fire until it finally surrendered to exhaustion and water, checking on the injured, arranging shelter for the families whose homes had burned. By the time the sun rose over the smoking ruins, Winifred was covered in soot and ash, her hands blistered from hauling water, and she had never in her life felt more like she belonged somewhere than she did standing beside her husband in the wreckage of that terrible night. Marcus insisted on tending to her burned hands himself once they returned to the house, ignoring her protests that a servant could do it just as well. He sat across from her in the small parlor off the kitchen, gently applying salve to her palms with a concentration that seemed far too intense for the simple task. "You frightened me tonight," he said quietly, not looking up from her hands. "I have not been frightened like that in a very long time." "I could not simply stand by," Winifred said, "not while a child might have been in danger." "I know," Marcus said. "That is rather the trouble, is it not? You would not simply stand by. You never have, since the moment you arrived in this house, though I have given you little enough reason to care what happens here." Winifred watched him carefully, this rare unguarded moment stretching between them like something fragile that might shatter if either of them moved too quickly. "Why do you keep such distance from me, Marcus? What is it you are so afraid to say?" For a moment, She thought he might actually answer her. His hands stilled on hers, his eyes lifted to meet her own, and something vulnerable moved across his face that she had never seen there before. But then the study door opened, and a footman announced a visitor, and whatever moment had been building between them scattered like smoke in the wind. The visitor was Lord Rupert Sandringham, a name Winifred had not heard spoken aloud in months but recognized instantly from her old life. He had courted her briefly before her family's ruin had made such a match impossible. A charming, handsome man who had always seemed more interested in her dowry than in her, though she had been young enough once to mistake his attention for genuine affection. "Winifred," he said warmly, stepping into the parlor as though he had every right to be there, ignoring Marcus's presence entirely. "I heard of the fire and came at once to see that you were unharmed. You cannot imagine my relief to find you well." Marcus rose slowly, his expression shuddering closed in an instant, all the warmth of moments before vanishing behind a mask of cold politeness. "Lord Sandringham, how thoughtful of you to call, though I was not aware you and my wife were still in correspondence." "We are old friends, Your Grace," Rupert said smoothly, though his eyes lingered on Winifred a moment too long for the word friends to feel entirely accurate. "I would not wish for her to feel forgotten by those who cared for her before her fortunes changed so dramatically." The barb landed exactly where it was meant to, and Winifred saw Marcus's jaw tighten at the implication that her marriage had been nothing more than a change in fortune, a transaction, the very word he himself had used on their wedding night. "My wife wants for nothing," Marcus said, his voice cold as winter stone, least of all the attention of men who abandoned her the moment her circumstances required real sacrifice. Rupert's smile faltered only slightly. "I merely wished to offer my concern for her welfare." "Consider it offered," Marcus said, "and now consider it time to take your leave." The dismissal was clear and absolute, and Rupert had little choice but to bow and depart, though not before catching Winifred's eye with a look that suggested this would not be his last visit. When the door closed behind him, the silence in the parlor felt heavier than before, the fragile openness of moments earlier now buried beneath fresh tension. "You need not have been so harsh with him," Winifred said carefully, though she felt no real sympathy for Rupert Sandringham. "Did you wish him to stay?" Marcus asked, and something dangerous flickered in his voice, something that sounded almost like jealousy, though he would never have named it as such. "I wish to finish our conversation," Winifred said honestly, the one he interrupted. Marcus looked at her for a long moment, and she thought again that he might finally say what he had been holding back for months. Instead, he gathered his composure like a familiar coat and stepped back from her, the distance returning to his eyes like a door closing. "It is late," he said. "You should rest. Today has been difficult enough already." He left the room before she could argue, leaving her alone with her bandaged hands and the frustrating certainty that she had come so close to finally understanding her husband, only to watch the chance slip away yet again. In the days that followed, the rebuilding of the tenant cottages gave Winifred and Marcus reason to work closely together, planning repairs, arranging temporary housing, distributing supplies to families who had lost everything. Winifred found herself impressed by her husband's genuine care for his tenants, a warmth he showed so freely to others while keeping it so carefully locked away from her. She began to understand, in fragments and glimpses, that Marcus was not a cold man by nature, but a man who had built walls for reasons she did not yet fully understand. She saw it in the way Lady Cordelia Fenley, his aunt, watched him sometimes with worry rather than judgment. She saw it in the careful way the old staff spoke of the late Duke, Marcus's father, always trailing off before finishing their sentences, as though some old wound still lived in those unfinished thoughts. One afternoon, while reviewing repair costs together in the study, their hands brushed reaching for the same ledger, and neither of them pulled away as quickly as propriety demanded. Marcus looked up at her, and for the first time since their wedding night, she saw something in his eyes that looked unmistakably like longing. "Winifred," he said quietly, her name still unfamiliar and precious on his tongue after months of formal address. "I find that I think of you far more than I intended to when we married." Her heart leapt despite every warning her mind offered. "Is that meant to be a confession, Your Grace?" A ghost of a smile touched his mouth, the first genuine one she had seen from him. "I suppose it might be, if I were brave enough to call it that." But even as the words hung between them, warm and fragile as candlelight, Winifred could see the fear still lurking beneath his eyes, the same fear that had built the walls in the first place, and she understood, with a sinking certainty, that this small opening might close again just as quickly as it had appeared. She was right to worry. Lady Seraphina Kello had already begun her quiet campaign to ensure it did. That evening, Marcus surprised her by asking her to walk with him after dinner, something he had never once suggested in all their months of marriage. They walked together through the gardens in the fading light, and for the first time, he spoke to her freely of his childhood, of a father who had believed affection made a man weak, who had punished tears with cold silence, and rewarded composure with the closest thing he offered to praise. "I was perhaps 7 the last time I cried in front of him," Marcus said quietly, staring ahead at the darkening tree line rather than at her. "I had fallen from my horse and broken my wrist, and I wept from the pain of it. He looked at me as though I had disappointed him more thoroughly than anything else I had ever done, and told me that a Camborne does not weep, no matter the wound. I never cried in front of him again, not even when he died." Winifred said nothing for a long moment, simply reaching for his hand as they walked, and to her quiet relief, he did not pull away. "That does not sound like strength to me," she said finally. "That sounds like a boy taught to hide his heart so thoroughly he forgot he was allowed to have one at all." Marcus glanced at her then, something startled and grateful in his expression, as though no one had ever offered him quite that particular kindness before. "Perhaps," he said softly, "I have spent so many years believing his lessons were simply the price of my position, that I have rarely stopped to ask whether they were true at all." They walked in comfortable silence after that, the space between them smaller than it had been in all the months since their wedding, and when they returned to the house, Marcus lifted her hand to his lips before they parted for the night, a small gesture that left Winifred's heart racing long after she had retired to her chamber, more hopeful than she had allowed herself to feel in a very long time. The letter arrived on a gray morning, slipped onto Marcus's desk by a hand no one in the household would later admit to, and by the time he finished reading it, his face had gone the color of ash. It claimed, in careful, damning script, that Winifred had been seen meeting privately with Lord Rupert Sandringham in the village, that she had written to him for months before her marriage and continued to do so after, that her concern for the tenants and her sudden devotion to Camborne affairs were nothing more than a performance to disguise an arrangement that had nothing to do with loyalty to her husband. None of it was true. Every word of it had been crafted by Lady Seraphina Kello, who had watched with growing alarm as the distance between Marcus and his wife began to close, and who had decided, with cold calculation, that she would rather destroy the marriage than watch it succeed. Marcus did not investigate the claims. He did not ask Winifred directly, did not give her the chance to explain, did not pause to remember the woman who had run toward a burning cottage without hesitation, who had held his gaze with nothing but honesty in the weeks since. Instead, the old fear that had shaped his entire life, the fear his father had carved into him since childhood, that he was destined to be betrayed by anyone who claimed to care for him, rose up and swallowed every fragile inch of trust he had begun to build. He found her in the garden that afternoon, cutting flowers for the dinner table, humming softly to herself, in a way that would have warmed his heart only a day before. Now it only made the betrayal feel sharper. "Did you think I would not learn of it?" he demanded, the letter crumpled in his fist. Winifred turned, startled by the venom in his voice. "Learn of what, Marcus? What has happened?" "Do not," he said, his voice shaking with a fury she had never seen from him. "Do not stand there and pretend innocence. I know about Sandringham. I know about your letters, your meetings, your continued arrangement with him." Winifred stared at him, genuinely bewildered for a moment, before understanding began to dawn, followed swiftly by outrage. "You believe I have been meeting Lord Sandringham, that I have written to him?" "Marcus, I have not spoken to that man since the night he came to this house, and even then only because you were present the entire time." "Someone has informed me otherwise," Marcus said, though even as he spoke, some small, honest part of him noted how thin his own certainty sounded aloud. "Someone," Winifred repeated coldly. "And you take the word of some anonymous someone over the word of your own wife, without so much as asking me directly before condemning me." "You forget," Marcus said, and the cruelty in his next words came from a place of fear rather than truth, though the wound they left was no less real. "I did not marry you for love, Winifred. I married you as a transaction, as you well know, having heard those very words yourself on our wedding night. Perhaps I should not be surprised that you would seek elsewhere what this marriage was never meant to provide." The words landed like a physical blow. Winifred went very still, the flowers falling from her hands to scatter across the garden path. "You knew," she said quietly. "You knew I heard you say that, and you have let me believe, all these months, that perhaps something had changed. That perhaps you had come to see me as something more than a transaction, and now you throw those very words back at me as a weapon." Marcus's certainty faltered at the raw pain in her voice, but the fear that had driven him this far was not so easily silenced. "I am simply speaking the truth of how this marriage began." No, Winifred said, and her voice had gone very cold, very steady. The voice of a woman who had decided something important in the space of a single terrible conversation. You are punishing me for a betrayal that exists only in your own fear, because it is easier to believe I have wronged you than to believe that I might actually care for you, and that caring might require something of you in return. You are a coward, Marcus Ellery, hiding behind cruelty because honesty terrifies you far more than any letter ever could. She walked past him into the house without another word, leaving him standing alone among the scattered flowers, the crumpled letter still clenched in his fist, already beginning to doubt everything he had just done and said, though pride would not yet allow him to admit it. That evening, dinner passed in silence heavier than any they had shared in the early days of their marriage. Winifred barely touched her food. Marcus stared at his plate without eating it all. Lady Cordelia, visiting for the week, watched the tension between them with growing alarm, though neither of them offered any explanation for the sudden, brittle atmosphere that had replaced the warmth she had noticed growing between them just days before. After dinner, Cordelia found her nephew alone in his study, staring into the fire with an expression she had not seen on his face since his father's funeral. "Whatever has happened between you and your wife," she said without preamble, settling into the chair across from him, "I hope you have the sense to fix it before your pride costs you something you cannot get back." "She has deceived me," Marcus said, though the words felt hollow even as he spoke them. "Has she?" Cordelia asked sharply. "Or has someone deceived you into believing she has? I have watched Serafina Kello circling this house since your wedding day, Marcus, and I am not so old that I cannot recognize jealousy dressed up as concern when I see it." Marcus said nothing, but something in his expression shifted, the first crack of doubt beginning to show through his anger. "Your father taught you that love was a weakness to be guarded against," Cordelia continued, her voice softening. "He taught you that trust was a door that only ever led to betrayal. I watched what that lesson did to him, Marcus, and I watched what it nearly did to you as a boy. Do not let it destroy this marriage before it has even had the chance to become what it could be." "And if I am right?" Marcus asked quietly. "If she has deceived me?" "Then you will have lost nothing you had not already resigned yourself to losing," Cordelia said. "But if you are wrong, and I believe with my whole heart that you are, you will have thrown away the one thing your father's coldness never allowed him to have, a wife who might actually love you, if you would only let her." Marcus sat with his aunt's words long after she had retired for the evening, the fire burning low in the grate, the letter still sitting on his desk like an accusation he no longer fully trusted. He thought of Winifred running toward the burning cottage without hesitation. He thought of her hands, blistered from hauling water for tenants who were not even her own responsibility until circumstance had made them so. He thought of the honesty in her eyes when she had asked him why he kept such distance, and the vulnerability in his own voice when he had almost told her the truth. He rose finally and walked to her chamber door, raising his hand to knock, rehearsing some fragile beginning of an apology. But when he reached the door, he found it already ajar, and the room beyond was empty, the bed unslept in, a single note left upon the pillow in handwriting he recognized as his wife's. "I have gone to stay with Josephine Rowe until you are ready to trust me with the truth, whatever that truth may be. I will not spend my life defending myself against accusations built on nothing but fear. When you are ready to speak with honesty instead of cruelty, you know where to find me." Marcus stood alone in his wife's empty chamber, the note trembling slightly in his hand, and understood, far too late, exactly how much damage his own fear had caused. He sat that night in his study long past midnight, the fire burned down to embers, replaying the confrontation in the garden over and over, until every word he had spoken felt like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples of consequence he could not yet fully measure. He thought of the flowers scattered across the garden path, of the stricken look on Winifred's face when he had thrown his own overheard words back at her, and he found himself, for the first time since his father's funeral, close to tears he did not allow himself to shed. Griggs found him there at dawn, still fully dressed, staring at nothing, and the old steward, who had served the family long enough to remember Marcus as a boy hiding his own tears from a father who punished them, said nothing of judgment, only set a fresh pot of coffee at his elbow, and quietly closed the curtains against the rising sun. "Your Grace should rest," Griggs said carefully. "Whatever has happened can be mended in daylight far better than it can be worried over in darkness." "I am not certain it can be mended at all," Marcus said, his voice rough with exhaustion and something rawer beneath it. "I said things to her, Griggs, that I cannot unsay. I accused her of a betrayal I have no true evidence for, simply because I was afraid to believe anything good could last." Griggs was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice carried the careful weight of a man who had watched this family's wounds pass from father to son for decades. "If I may say so, Your Grace, fear makes liars of even honest men. It does not undo the harm done, but it does mean the harm can often be undone in turn, provided a man is willing to do the harder work of honesty afterward." Marcus turned the words over long after Griggs had left him alone again, and by the time the sun had fully risen, some fragile resolve had begun to take shape beneath his exhaustion, a determination that whatever pride still resisted the admission, he would go to his aunt, and then to his wife, and lay bare the truth of his fear, rather than let it fester any longer in silence. Winifred stayed at Josephine's small house in the village for 4 days before Marcus finally came to find her, and in those 4 days, she had time enough to think clearly for the first time since her wedding night. She thought about the fear she had seen in his eyes during the fire, real and unguarded, and the cruelty she had heard in his voice in the garden, born from that same fear turned inward and outward all at once. She thought about the man who had tended her burned hands with such gentle concentration, and the man who had thrown her own overheard words back at her like weapons. She could not decide, in those quiet, lonely days, whether she had married a man capable of love, who was too frightened to claim it, or a man who would always choose distance over vulnerability, no matter how much it cost them both. Josephine, ever practical, offered little comfort beyond blunt honesty. "You cannot fix a man's fear for him, Winifred. He must decide for himself whether he wants what you are offering, or whether he would rather live safely alone than risk being hurt again. That is not something you can control, no matter how much you love him." The word love hung in the air between them, and Winifred did not deny it, though she had not spoken it aloud even to herself until that moment. She did love him, foolishly and completely, this cold, guarded man who had shown her only glimpses of warmth before retreating each time behind his walls. She loved him, and that love had become a wound she did not know how to heal. When Marcus arrived at Josephine's door on the 5th morning, he looked as though he had not slept in days, his face drawn and pale, his eyes carrying an exhaustion that went far deeper than physical tiredness. Winifred received him in the small parlor, her spine straight, her expression carefully composed, though her heart pounded painfully in her chest. "I have learned the truth of the letter," Marcus said without preamble, his voice rough. "Serafina wrote it herself. She confessed when I confronted her directly, though she showed little remorse for the damage she had done. I could have told you that myself, had you asked me before condemning me," Winifred said quietly. "I know," Marcus said, and something in his voice broke slightly. "I know that now, and I knew it then, if I am honest. Even as I said the things I said to you, I was afraid, Winifred. I have spent my whole life being taught that trust leads only to betrayal, that anyone who claims to care for you is simply waiting for the moment to prove otherwise. My father made certain I learned that lesson thoroughly, and when I began to feel something for you, something I had sworn never to feel for anyone, it terrified me more than any battlefield or any debt ever could." Winifred said nothing for a long moment, letting his words settle, watching the vulnerability in his face that she had glimpsed only in fragments before now laid bare in full. "That does not excuse what you said to me," she said finally. "Fear is not a reason to wound someone you claim to care for." "I know," Marcus said again, quieter now. "I have no excuse worthy of the pain I caused you. I only ask that you return home, and give me the chance to prove that I can be better than my fear, if you will still have me." Winifred looked at him for a long time, this man who had finally, after months of careful distance, shown her the truth beneath his walls, and something in her chest ached with the weight of hope she had almost let herself abandon. "I will return," she said finally. "But Marcus, I cannot live in a marriage built on fear that might turn to cruelty every time something frightens you. If we are to build something real between us, it must be built on trust, not on the walls you learned from your father. I need to know you are willing to try, truly try, not simply apologize and return to old habits the next time doubt creeps in." "I am willing," Marcus said, and for the first time since their wedding day, she believed him completely. They returned to Cambourne House together, and for a few precious weeks, something new began to grow between them, fragile but real, built slowly through small honesties rather than grand declarations. Marcus began sharing more of himself, speaking of his father's coldness, of the years he had spent believing that love was simply another word for eventual loss. Winifred, in turn, allowed herself to hope more openly, to let the walls she had built for her own protection begin to soften. But Serafina Kello was not finished. Exposed and humiliated, cast out from Marcus's circle after her confession, she turned her attention instead to Rupert Sandringham, and together the two of them crafted a scheme far more dangerous than a single false letter. It began with whispers in society circles, carefully placed suggestions that Winifred's family debts had never truly been settled, that Frederick Colton's gambling had continued even after the marriage, funded quietly by his sister's new position, that Winifred had married Marcus not out of any genuine regard, but purely to secure funds for her brother's continued vices. The whispers reached Marcus slowly, through careful, deniable channels, each one small enough to dismiss individually, but accumulating over weeks into something that once again began to poison the fragile trust they had built. Marcus tried, at first, to resist the doubt creeping back into his thoughts. He remembered his promise to Winifred, remembered the pain his earlier accusations had caused, but when a forged banknote arrived, seemingly proving that funds had indeed been transferred from the Camborne accounts to cover fresh gambling debts, the fear that had shaped his entire life rose up once more, and this time, exhausted from months of fighting it, he did not have the strength to push it back down. He confronted Winifred in the study, the forged document laid between them on the desk, his voice carrying none of the fury of their previous quarrel, but something worse, something quieter and more final. "I want to believe you had nothing to do with this," he said, gesturing to the paper. "I want very badly to believe it. But I find I no longer know how to trust my own judgment where you are concerned, Winifred. Every time I allow myself to hope, something arrives to prove that hope foolish." "This document is false," Winifred said, examining it carefully. "Marcus, look at the signature. It does not match my brother's hand at all. This is exactly what Serafina and Sandringham did before, another lie designed to tear us apart." "Perhaps," Marcus said wearily, "or perhaps I am simply a fool who wishes so desperately to believe in something good that I refuse to see the truth even when it stands before me plainly." "You are choosing fear again," Winifred said, her voice steady despite the tears gathering in her eyes. "You promised me you would try, and instead you are letting the smallest doubt undo everything we have built." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, staring at the forged document, at his own trembling hands, at the woman across from him whom he loved more than he had ever allowed himself to love anyone, and whom his own broken trust seemed determined to push away no matter how much it cost him. "I cannot keep doing this to you," he said finally, and his voice had gone hollow, defeated. "I cannot keep hurting you every time my own fear gets the better of me. You deserve a husband who can trust you fully, without doubt, without this constant battle against ghosts my father left behind. I do not know if I am capable of being that man, Winifred, and I will not keep you trapped in a marriage that causes you this much pain simply because I am too weak to overcome my own history." "What are you saying?" Winifred asked, though some terrible part of her already knew. "I am saying you are free to leave," Marcus said, the words costing him more than she could possibly know, though his voice remained carefully controlled, carefully distant, the same wall rising between them, that had stood there since their wedding night. "If you wish to return to your family, to build a life away from this house and from me, I will not stand in your way. I will provide for you generously, ensure your comfort and your brother's security, whatever you require. You need not stay bound to a man who cannot seem to stop wounding you." He meant it, in that moment, as an act of love, however twisted and broken, a final attempt to protect her from the damage he believed himself doomed to keep causing. He expected her to argue, to fight for the marriage, to prove through her resistance that she wanted to stay despite everything. He did not understand, watching her face go pale and still, that his words had landed not as a gift but as the final, devastating confirmation of every fear she had carried since her wedding night, that she had always been, in the end, disposable to him. Winifred stood very slowly, her hands folded in front of her, her expression carefully composed in a way that broke his heart more than any tears could have. "I see," she said quietly. "Winifred." "No," she said, holding up a hand to stop him. "You have made your feelings clear enough, Marcus. I am free to leave." "Very well." She reached up with trembling fingers and began to remove her wedding ring, the gold band that had sat on her hand since the night she agreed to marry a stranger to save her family, the ring that had, despite everything, come to mean something far deeper to her than the transaction it had begun as. She worked it slowly over her knuckle, her hands shaking slightly, her eyes fixed on the ring rather than on her husband's stricken face. Marcus watched, frozen, as the ring came free, watched as she set it gently on the desk between them, the small sound of metal against wood, impossibly loud in the silence of the study. "I loved you," she said simply, her voice breaking on the word for the first time. "I know you never asked for that, and I know it changes nothing about the fear that lives inside you, but I want you to know, before I go, That whatever this marriage began as, it stopped being a transaction for me a long time ago. I am sorry that you could never quite believe the same was true for you." She turned and walked from the study without another word, leaving the ring behind on the desk, leaving Marcus alone, with the terrible silence of a house that had, for a few brief weeks, felt almost like a home. He did not move for a long time after she left. He sat staring at the ring, at the small gold band that represented everything he had just thrown away out of fear, disguised as noble sacrifice, and slowly, painfully, the full weight of what he had done began to settle over him. Upstairs, Winifred began to pack, her movements mechanical, her mind carefully blank, refusing to let herself feel the full devastation of what had just happened, until she was safely away from this house that had promised her so much, and delivered, in the end, only heartbreak, dressed up as freedom. Mr. Griggs found the forged banknote still lying on the study desk the next morning, beside a wedding ring no one had yet moved, and something about the sight of it, combined with the news that the Duchess had ordered her trunks packed for an early departure, sent him hurrying to find Lady Cordelia before he had even finished his usual rounds. "Something is very wrong here," he told her, showing her the document with hands that trembled slightly despite his years of steady service. "This signature, my lady. I have managed the Colton family accounts myself in the past, before the Duchess's marriage. I know Captain Colton's hand well, and I would swear on my life this is not it." Cordelia examined the forgery carefully, her sharp eyes narrowing as she studied the careful but ultimately clumsy imitation of a signature that did not, upon close inspection, match at all. "Serafina Kello," she said grimly. "And that wretched Sandringham creature, no doubt working together this time. Where is my nephew?" She found Marcus still in the study, exactly where Griggs had left him hours before, staring at the ring on his desk as though it might somehow undo the damage of the previous evening, simply by existing there. "You are a fool," Cordelia said without preamble, dropping the forged document onto the desk beside the ring. "A complete and utter fool, Marcus Ellery, and I say that with all the love an aunt is permitted to carry for a nephew she has watched destroy his own happiness not once, but twice now over the same tired fear." "I know," Marcus said hollowly, not even bothering to argue. "I have known it since the moment she walked out that door." "Then you also know this document is forged," Cordelia said. Griggs recognized it immediately. "The signature does not match Captain Colton's hand at all. This was never real, Marcus. It was Serafina's doing, or Sandringham's, or both of them together, exactly as before." Marcus's head snapped up, hope and horror crashing together across his face in equal measure. "Are you certain?" "Griggs managed the Colton accounts himself for years before Winifred's marriage," Cordelia said. "He would know the signature better than anyone in this house. This was a lie, Marcus, crafted by two bitter, jealous people who could not bear to see you happy. And you believed it because some broken part of you still expects every good thing in your life to be a lie waiting to be exposed." Marcus stood abruptly, the chair scraping loudly against the floor, his mind already racing through everything he had said the night before. Every word that had sent his wife walking out that door with tears in her eyes, and his ring left behind on the desk. "I told her she was free to leave," he said, the words tasting like ash even now. "I meant it as an act of love, Cordelia. I thought I was protecting her from myself." "You meant it as a coward's escape," Cordelia said, not unkindly, but without softening the truth either. "You gave her exactly what your fear wanted to give her, an excuse to leave before you had to face the terrifying possibility that she might actually choose to stay, that she might actually love you despite everything. Do not dress cowardice up as sacrifice, Marcus. It does not suit you." The truth of her words landed harder than any accusation could have, precisely because Marcus recognized them as accurate the moment he heard them spoken aloud. He had not offered Winifred freedom out of love. He had offered it out of fear, a final desperate attempt to protect himself from the vulnerability of truly needing someone, dressed up in noble language that had fooled no one but himself. "Where is she now?" he asked, already moving toward the door. "Gone to the coaching inn, I should think, to arrange transport to her brother," Cordelia said. "If you intend to stop her, Marcus, you had better ride quickly, and you had better be prepared to say something considerably more honest than what you offered her last night." Marcus did not wait to hear anything further. He was already calling for his horse before Cordelia finished speaking, already running through the corridors of Cambourne House with a desperation he had never allowed himself to feel about anything, not even the fire that had nearly claimed a tenant's child weeks before. He understood now, with terrible clarity, that he had been so afraid of losing Winifred slowly, through the same betrayal his father had taught him to expect, that he had thrown her away himself, rather than risk waiting for the loss to arrive on its own terms. It was, he realized as he swung onto his horse, the most foolish and cowardly thing he had ever done, and he prayed with every mile of the ride into the village that it was not yet too late to undo it. Winifred was standing in the yard of the coaching inn, watching her trunks being loaded onto a hired carriage, when she heard the sound of hoofbeats approaching at a reckless pace that made several onlookers turn to stare. She did not need to look up to know who it was. Some part of her heart recognized the rhythm of that particular horse's gallop before her mind had even fully processed the sound. Marcus arrived breathless, dismounting before his horse had fully stopped, his hair disheveled, his coat unbuttoned, looking nothing like the composed, distant Duke who had married her nearly a year before. He looked, Winifred thought with a strange, aching tenderness she could not quite suppress despite everything, like a man who had run the entire distance from Cambourne House rather than ridden it. "The document was forged," he said, before she could speak, before propriety or pride could stop him. "Griggs confirmed it this morning. Serafina and Sandringham crafted it together, exactly as they did with the letter before. Your brother never touched those funds, Winifred. None of it was true." "I told you as much last night," Winifred said quietly, though something in her chest had begun to ache with fresh hope she was almost too afraid to feel. "I know," Marcus said. "I know you did, and I did not listen, because I was too consumed by my own fear to hear the truth even when it stood directly in front of me. Winifred, I did not tell you that you were free to leave because I wished you gone. I told you because I was terrified, more terrified than I have ever been of anything in my entire life, of continuing to hope that you might stay, and then losing you anyway when my fear finally proved itself justified. I gave you an exit because taking one myself felt safer than waiting to see whether you might choose to remain." The onlookers in the coaching yard had begun to gather at a discreet but curious distance, sensing the drama unfolding before them, but Marcus seemed entirely unaware of their presence, his eyes fixed only on his wife's face, searching for some sign of what she might be feeling. "You called it freedom," Winifred said, her voice trembling slightly despite her best efforts to remain composed. "But it did not feel like freedom to me, Marcus. It felt like being told, once again, that I had never truly mattered to you at all, that everything I had begun to hope for between us was only ever in my own imagination. You matter to me more than anything in this world," Marcus said, and the raw honesty in his voice silenced the small crowd around them entirely. "I have loved you since the night of the fire, Winifred, perhaps before that even, though I was too much of a coward to admit it, even to myself. I have spent this entire marriage so afraid of loving you and losing you, that I very nearly threw away my chance to love you at all. That fear was never about you. It was about my father, about every lesson he taught me to protect myself with, and I let it nearly cost me the only real happiness I have ever known." Winifred felt tears gathering despite her determination not to cry in front of a coaching yard full of strangers, but she no longer had the strength to hold them back entirely. "I removed my ring because I believed you did not want me," she said. "Because I believed, after everything, that I would always be nothing more than a transaction to you, no matter how much I hoped otherwise." "You were never a transaction," Marcus said, closing the distance between them slowly, giving her every opportunity to step back if she wished it, though she did not move. "You are the only real thing that has happened to me since my mother died, Winifred. I was a fool to ever let you believe otherwise, and I will spend however long it takes to prove to you that the words I said on our wedding night were the lie, not the love I have come to feel for you since." He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew the ring, the small gold band she had left behind on his desk the night before, holding it out to her not as a demand but as an offering, his hand trembling slightly as he did so. "I cannot make you take this back," he said. "I have given you every reason to walk away from me, and if you choose to go, I will honor that choice, and provide for you and your brother however you require. But I am asking you, with whatever honesty I have left in me, to stay. Not because duty binds you to me, and not because I have offered you an exit I hoped you would refuse. I am asking because I love you, completely and without reservation, and because I cannot imagine the rest of my life without you in it." Winifred looked at the ring in his outstretched hand, then at the man holding it, this proud, guarded Duke who had finally, after everything, laid himself bare before her in the middle of a public coaching yard, risking every ounce of the composure he had spent his entire life building. She thought of the fire, of his hands tending her burns with such careful gentleness, of the small cracks of warmth he had shown her in quiet moments before fear always dragged him back behind his walls. She thought of her own heart, which had never truly stopped hoping despite everything, no matter how many times that hope had been wounded. "You must promise me something," she said finally. her voice steadier now. "The next time fear rises in you, Marcus, you must come to me with it, rather than pushing me away because of it. I cannot build a life with a man who runs from doubt, instead of speaking it aloud. If we are to try this again, truly try, it must be built on honesty, even when honesty is difficult." "I promise," Marcus said, and the relief in his voice was so profound that Winifred felt her own resolve softening entirely. "I promise you honesty, Winifred, for as long as you will have me." She held out her hand, and he slid the ring back onto her finger with careful, reverent hands, the small crowd in the coaching yard breaking into a scattered round of applause that neither of them fully noticed, too caught up in the quiet, private joy of finding their way back to each other. They returned to Cambourne House together that afternoon, and this time, when Marcus took her hand as they walked through the front doors, he did not let it go. Serafina Kello and Lord Rupert Sandringham were dealt with swiftly in the weeks that followed. Marcus, with evidence of the forgeries firmly in hand, ensured that both were thoroughly and publicly discredited within society circles, their scheming exposed to anyone who might have believed their earlier whispers. Serafina left the county entirely within the month, her reputation too damaged to salvage, while Sandringham found himself quietly but firmly excluded from every gathering that mattered, his charm no longer enough to overcome the taint of his exposed deception. Frederick Colton, meanwhile, returned safely from his naval assignment, his ship having weathered the dangerous waters without serious incident, and Winifred wept with relief when his letter finally arrived confirming his safe passage home. Marcus welcomed his brother-in-law to Cambourne House with a warmth that surprised them both, the two men finding an easy friendship built on mutual respect, rather than the obligation that had first brought their families together. As the months passed, Cambourne House began to feel less like the cold, echoing mansion Winifred had first entered as a stranger, and more like a true home, filled with the small warmths of a marriage finally built on honesty rather than fear. Marcus still struggled, at times, with the old instincts his father had carved into him, but he no longer hid those struggles from his wife. When doubt rose, he spoke it aloud, and Winifred met each confession with patience rather than judgment, understanding that healing old wounds took time neither of them needed to rush. Lady Cordelia watched the transformation of her nephew's marriage with quiet satisfaction, often remarking to Griggs over evening tea that she had never seen a man so thoroughly and happily undone by love after spending so many years determined to avoid it entirely. The invitation to the Cambourne Winter Ball went out to every notable family in the county, and Winifred stood in her chamber on the evening of the event, watching her reflection in the mirror as her maid fastened the final clasp of a deep blue gown, remembering with a small private smile the very different woman who had stood before this same mirror on her wedding night, alone and grieving a marriage she believed had already failed before it began. Marcus appeared in her doorway as the maid finished, dismissing the girl with a gentle nod before crossing the room to stand behind his wife, meeting her eyes in the mirror's reflection. "You look magnificent," he said quietly, his hands resting on her shoulders with an easy familiarity that would have seemed impossible a year before. "You look nervous," Winifred replied, turning to study his face more directly. It was true. Something in his expression carried a tension she recognized from the early days of their marriage, though it no longer frightened her the way it once had. "I have something I intend to say tonight," Marcus admitted. "Something I should have said publicly long before now, and I find myself uncharacteristically anxious about the prospect." Winifred raised an eyebrow, curious, but he only smiled and offered his arm, refusing to elaborate further as they descended together to greet their guests. The ball unfolded exactly as such events always did, filled with music and conversation and the careful social maneuvering that governed every gathering of consequence. Winifred moved through the evening with an ease that would have seemed impossible to the frightened young bride who had once dreaded even a simple visit from Lady Serafina Kello. She was, after all this time, no longer merely tolerated as an unexpected duchess. She had become, in the eyes of the county, someone worth knowing in her own right, respected for her genuine care for the tenants, and her evident, if once uncertain, place at her husband's side. Frederick Colton attended as well, newly promoted and looking every inch the proud naval officer, standing beside Josephine Rowe, whom he had begun courting with a seriousness that made Winifred's heart swell with hope for her dear friend's happiness. The two of them danced together twice, drawing knowing smiles from those who noticed, and Winifred found herself watching them with the particular joy of someone who understood exactly how precious a good match could be, having so nearly missed finding one herself. It was near midnight, as the musicians paused between sets and the guests gathered near the refreshment tables, that Marcus surprised the entire assembly by requesting a moment of their attention, his voice carrying clearly across the ballroom in a way that immediately silenced the murmur of conversation. "I find myself compelled tonight to say something I have long left unsaid," he began, and Winifred felt her breath catch, uncertain what he intended, though she recognized the same vulnerable honesty in his eyes that she had seen in the coaching yard so many months before. "When I married my wife, I did so under circumstances that many of you likely remember, or have at least heard whispered about in less charitable terms than they deserve. Ours was, in its beginning, a marriage born of necessity rather than affection, and I confess I treated it as such for longer than I am proud to admit." A murmur rippled through the crowd, though Marcus continued without pause, his eyes fixed only on Winifred now, as though the rest of the room had ceased to exist entirely. "I very nearly lost her," he said, his voice roughening slightly. "Through my own fear and my own foolishness, I very nearly threw away the greatest gift I have ever been given, believing that protecting myself from vulnerability was worth more than the chance to truly love someone. I was wrong, and I have spent every day since learning just how wrong I was." He turned fully toward her now, reaching for her hand in front of the entire assembled county, his composure entirely abandoned in favor of something far more precious. "Winifred, you came into my life as a stranger bound to me by circumstance, and you have become, in every way that matters, the truest partner and the deepest love I have ever known. I want everyone in this room to hear it plainly, so there can be no more whispers, no more doubt about the nature of this marriage. I love you completely, and I consider myself the most fortunate man in England to call you my wife." The ballroom erupted into applause, genuine and warm, and Winifred felt tears gathering that she made no attempt to hide, not this time, not in front of a room full of witnesses to the very transformation her marriage had undergone. Marcus lifted her hand to his lips, and then, breaking every rule of propriety the assembled guests had ever known, kissed her properly in front of them all, drawing a fresh wave of delighted applause, and more than a few knowing laughs, from those who had watched the marriage's rocky beginning with skeptical eyes. Lady Cordelia, watching from near the refreshment table with Griggs at her side, dabbed at her own eyes with unashamed sentimentality. "I told him he was a fool," she said to the steward, though her voice carried nothing but fondness. "I am pleased to say he has finally proven me wrong about the outcome, even if it took him considerably longer than it should have to get there." Griggs merely smiled and refilled her glass, having long ago learned that some victories were best enjoyed quietly rather than remarked upon further. The winter passed into spring, and Cambourne House continued its slow, steady transformation from the cold, echoing mansion Winifred had first entered into a home filled with genuine warmth. Marcus took to joining her on her morning walks through the gardens, no longer watching her from his study window with careful distance but walking beside her, hand in hand, discussing estate matters and small private jokes with equal ease. The old chapel at the edge of the grounds, once her solitary refuge from loneliness, became instead a place they visited together, Marcus finally sharing the childhood memories that had once made it his own quiet sanctuary from his father's coldness. When Winifred discovered, in early summer, that she was carrying their first child, she told Marcus in that very chapel, watching his face transform through shock into a joy so complete it left him briefly speechless, a rare occurrence for a man who had once guarded every expression with such careful precision. He knelt before her right there among the dusty pews, pressing his lips gently to her still flat stomach, and Winifred understood in that moment that whatever fears still lingered from his father's harsh lessons, they no longer had any real power over the life they were building together. Frederick and Josephine married the following autumn, in the very chapel where Marcus had once hidden from his childhood loneliness, now restored and filled with flowers and laughter, befitting a celebration rather than a place of solitary retreat. Winifred stood beside her brother as he made his vows, Marcus's hand resting warmly at the small of her back, and she thought, watching Frederick's evident joy, of how far both siblings had traveled from that frightened evening when he had confessed the family's ruin, and she had agreed to marry a stranger to save them both. Their daughter was born the following spring, a small, fierce creature with her father's dark eyes and her mother's stubborn determination, already evident in her earliest cries. Marcus held her for the first time with hands that trembled slightly, the same hands that had once tended his wife's burned palms with such careful concentration, and Winifred watched him fall instantly and completely in love with their child, in a way that erased whatever last shadows his own father's coldness had left behind. Years later, when their daughter was old enough to ask about the small gold ring her mother always wore, Winifred would tell her the story in careful, gentle pieces, of a marriage that had begun as duty and very nearly ended in heartbreak before finding its way, through honesty and courage, into something far greater than either of them had dared hope for at the beginning. She would leave out the sharpest edges of the pain, but she would never pretend the fear had not been real, believing her daughter deserved to understand that love worth keeping was sometimes love that had to be fought for, rebuilt, and chosen again, deliberately and completely, long after the wedding vows had first been spoken. Marcus, listening from the doorway on those quiet evenings, would often catch Winifred's eye across the room and smile, remembering the terrified bride who had once removed her wedding ring in grief, and the proud, relieved husband who had placed it back upon her finger in a coaching yard full of strangers, having finally understood that the greatest transaction of his life had never been the marriage contract at all, but the quiet, daily choice to love her, honestly and completely, for every day that followed.